rather simplistic terms so far with regard to the terms of trade. So this just sort of brings it together in a bit more advanced economics, really, where we're not only considering, demand and supply, but we're now also considering, well, actually, the income elasticity of demand will have an impact, and the price elasticity of demand will also have an impact. And you could also maybe even bring in a little bit of cross-price sort of substitutes as well, if you wanted to. And it's not unheard of, let's face it, on the exam for the essay question to be on elasticities, which most candidates steer clear of, because if you're just presented with a question about elasticity, that can be, you think, well, how on earth can I write, 25 mark essay question on that? So there's an awful lot to say about this, really. So we'll start with the basics, which we've already done, of course. Terms of trade, your index of exports over your index of imports. But of course, we know, and we've said in the past, that the terms of trade of developing nations has a tendency to decline over time. And that was sort of put down in black and white, if you will, by Mr. Prebisch and Mr. Singer when they came up with this hypothesis. So it's more of a sort of statement rather than any groundbreaking theory. It's a fairly obvious thing, I think, to say. So why does that happen? Well, because of the nature of the less developed countries' comparative advantage. So what do they have a comparative advantage in? They have a comparative advantage in agriculture, the primary sector, and what's happening in that sector globally, not just in the primary, the developing nations. Well, intensive farming, by that we mean, Ali? On a large scale, economies of scale, but also using lots of machinery and, but how do you increase your well, in the developed world, it would be capital intensive. In the developing, it would be labour intensive. But what do farms now use to try and boost the crop? Fertilizers. Yeah, and they try and enhance the amount that they can produce using these intensive farming methods. So all of that combined serves to increase the supply, and therefore when you're selling into a global market, you're not just selling Uganda's crop or Zambia's crop or whatever it might be. You're selling globally, so you have to compete globally. So if global supply is going up, the price on the world stage is falling. So Megan, if the price on the world stage is falling and you're living in Uganda, what will you have to do? Right. So in order to compete, you then have to reduce your price to be price competitive. But what is the downside from the terms of trade point of view? Ratio of export prices over ratio of import prices. The result of that will be that PX drops, and so you get this deterioration. Okay, so Megan, why is that a bad thing? So what's problematic about that then?
Does it mean that
So why is a deterioration in the tot? Why is that a bad thing?
does it, like, when they're trying to put together like HDI and stuff, does it make a country look less developed than it might actually be?
And how would they seek to put together, as you say, HDI,
Like using the different components,
which are
like literacy rates and life expectancy.
and three components. The one that we all use, which is why they throw in the other two.
GDP.
Per capita. Yeah. GDP per capita. Yeah, okay, well, in order to build schools, in order to build hospitals, what do they need?
Money.
To buy
Like
capital goods from
elsewhere. Like more developed.
the developed world. Right, okay. So a deterioration, and I think we've looked at this before in terms of a ratio, the deterioration means that for every unit of X you sell, you can bring in, Megan, can you bring in more M or can you bring in less?
Less.
Correct. Hence the reason it's a problem. So if you want to bring in a JCB from abroad, if your terms of trade is deteriorating, then you'll have to sell ever more units of whatever primary commodity you sell to bring in that particular import.
Does that not sort of conflict with the trade balance though?
Hang on. So each unit of X will buy fewer M. And therefore, if you are importing capital goods to develop, to build the schools, to build the hospitals, to build the roads, to build the railways, to build the airports, to build all of these things, that will become increasingly problematic if the thing that you are selling on global markets is becoming worth less and less and less and less. Now, of course, if it was an improvement, happy days. Yeah. Okay, now what was your question, Alana?
Does it not like conflict with the trade balance? Because presumably, like, if the quality's staying the same, then that's going to improve the trade balance, which is going to increase AD, which is going to increase economic growth, which is going to make it more developed. So could you not go both
Okay,
ways?
well, I like the way you've used that sort of those linking statements together. You know, this leads to this leads to this. You're obviously listening to Paul Morse and reading his presentation last week. But what you're saying is, does that not link directly to this next section on PED? I think it does. So, a very basic answer on this would talk about what we've talked about so far, but a more advanced answer would then start to talk about the relative elasticities of demand, particularly. So if you think, Alana, you asked the questions, so you can kind of derive the answers here. The PED for primary goods,
Inelastic.
very inelastic, yes. So rather than having, as I've drawn here, as a relatively elastic demand curve, then the demand curve is much more inelastic. So that means that when the global supply goes up because of these intensive farming methods and the supply curve shifts to the right, you don't get this relatively small change in price. You get a much larger change in price. So if these two were drawn to scale the same size side by side, this P1 to P2 would be much bigger than this P1 to P2. Yeah? And therefore, so one of the problems is that when they're selling goods which are very, very inelastic in demand, you'd think that would be a good thing, wouldn't you, Ellie? Because why would you think PED less than 1 inelastic would be a good thing? What does it imply about the good? Yeah, it implies that everybody wants it. So you'd be thinking to yourself, well, surely that's to their advantage. But actually, quite the opposite. Because its demand is remaining fairly static, the supply is shifting, and therefore that exacerbates the price drop in the exports. Therefore, the deterioration is bigger than would otherwise be if it was a much more elastic good that they were selling. So that's what we mean here by exacerbating this particular problem. Right? Okay. So that again, that's fairly straightforward, standard, do that in GCSE economics really. But let's move on then to the sort of the YED. So YED being JM? Income elasticity of demand. Now, I've written a few values there, JM, and I'm hoping that that's sort of revision for you, but do you know what I mean here? Okay, so let's deal with the inferior one first, because I think it's the easiest one to deal with. So when you have an increase in your income, so bottom line, percentage change in income, so if that goes up for a superior good or a normal good, the quantity demanded would usually, for a normal good or a superior one, when your income goes up, you'd normally buy more of it. But your inferior, your DVD player, your flask from years gone by, your old mobile phone from years gone by. Right. Okay. And consequently, Megan, we've got negative over, which gives, hence, when YED is negative value, it's always right. Okay. So these two are the more interesting two. So let's say you get a 10% rise in your income or a 50% rise in your income. Are you suddenly going to, if you buy 2 loaves of bread a week, are you going to suddenly go out and buy 6 because you've had a 50% rise in your income? Right. You buy 2 pints of milk a day, green top. Are you suddenly going to buy 6 pints a day just because you've had this pay rise? No. Might you, though, buy, rather than 2, you might buy 3. Ellie, push the vote out, 3 rather than 2? Yeah, Ellie says yeah. Right, okay. So these kind of basic staples, when your income goes up, you're not going to go mad. You're not going to go mad for bread or loo rolls unless you're in a pandemic situation, in which case the opposite would be the case, of course. So there are circumstances where it would happen. But for most normal goods, day to day, when you've got this increase in your income, you might, if income goes up by 10%, how much more might you buy?
10%.
Right, I mean, you're not going to, 10% of the push. So you're not going to lob all your extra income into bread, cheese, crackers, biscuits, whatever it might be. But you might increase it by 5%. So 5 over 10, 0.5. So anything in that range is always a normal good. But 50% rise in your income, oh happy day, oh happy day. Next line. Yeah. Okay. Oh. So think, what would be a superior good then? A what, sorry? A what? Oh, sorry, I thought a thought instructor. Right, Thornton's chocolate, okay. Foreign holidays, I think is a really good example. So you might take 1 foreign holiday a year, but then you get your pay rise, and then instead of taking 1, you take 2, right? Now, what percent change is that? 100%. So you've had a 50% rise in your income, let's say, and rather than taking 1 foreign holiday, now you're taking 2, so you've got 100%. So in terms of your fraction, it's that's gone up by 100, that's 50, so it's 2. So therefore, now we're talking superior goods, right? So that's a little bit of revision on income elasticity of demand, which we did a long time ago. But it relates directly to this terms of trade. So first of all, the things that the LDCs export, which are, Megan? Primary goods, yeah. Are they in the normal, the superior, or the inferior? Right, so they're certainly not luxuries in most cases. Although, if it was gold or silver or something like that, then it might be. But if we're talking primary goods here, primary commodities, we're talking normal goods. So we're talking in this bracket here. Now, what's happening to, and I haven't written this on here, but what's happening to global incomes over time? Right, so global incomes over time are going up. So the bottom line of the fraction is going up. But are the 7 billion people on the planet rushing out to buy lots and lots more bread, milk, potatoes, etc., with their newly found wealth? No. So therefore, the income elasticity of demand will be between 0 and 1. Let's not hold the negative thought for a minute. Hold the negative thoughts for a minute. So it'll be between 0 and 1 because global incomes, we haven't mentioned that, so global incomes are going up. If you were to take that diagram, S1 to S2, what effect then will the increase in the global incomes have on the demand curve? To the left? If incomes are going up, and it's a normal good. Okay, but because it's between 0 and 1, is it going to shoot up way over here? Or is it just going to shift a little bit? Right, so it's going to be a very marginal shift to the right, maybe to here. So if you consider that this was our start point, P1, you're going to end up here at P3. So the overall effect, even though global incomes are rising, again, it's not really in the favour of the developing nation, because the developed world, what they want is cars and phones and electronic goods and things that make our life easy. They're not going to rush out and spend their newfound wealth on primary goods. So that sort of reinforces this elasticity problem, the price elasticity problem. Do you see that, Megan? No, Megan, it could be even worse because of this. So can you explain that in terms of the diagram?
Well, if it's an inferior good, would demand not shift to the left?
Right. Which would then,
Lower prices.
which would make the deterioration even bigger. Yeah. So if we were talking, if people globally regarded the output of sub-Saharan Africa, if they regarded that as an inferior good, something that they didn't want to touch with a barge pole, then the demand curve would shift to the left, and that would thereby exacerbate that problem. So inferior, you'd have D shift, not right, but left. As explained here. So as developing countries' income increases, they buy either a little more, shifting right, or they buy less, which would make it even worse. Now this last point here is probably the more interesting point, I think, on the whole board here. So the YED of the goods which the LDCs need to import. Ellie, talk to us about that. The YED of the goods which the LDCs are importing. So the LDCs are importing what? Capital, technology, all the mod cons, yeah. Okay, right, so that's not you finished, so keep going.
So if that income is increased,
Now,
then
how would you describe the YED for technology, capital? I mean, would it fit into normal, superior, or inferior?
superior.
Okay, I agree, yeah. Superior. So if global incomes go up by 50%, let's say, for example, over 100-year period or something, well, it's Ellie's.
Yeah, I'm not.
It's Ellie's chance to shine here. Come on, Ellie, keep going. If global incomes go up by 50%, and you're saying it's a superior good, so that we're on the M part here of the fraction now, Ellie. All right, so we're looking at the M. What's going to happen to the demand for the M because global incomes are going up? Exponentially, right? Now, what's that going to do then to the demand for the import? Tiny bit? Is that the best adjective you can come up with? Okay, right. By an enormous amount, which will do what to the price of the import? Right. Thereby making it even more. Exactly. Right, so here we're linking YED to demand and supply to the terms of trade. So what Ellie is saying is that the YED of the M is a superior good. What does that mean? It means as global incomes rise, there'll be a more than proportionate rise in demand. I'll have to write this somewhere else. As global incomes rise, demand for the import rises, to use Ali's phrase, big, rises even more. And so if you had a demand and supply diagram just for capital goods, which they're trying to import, the demand's going up massively, D1 to D2. Which is then impacting your ratio, because we know that has fallen already. So the export price has dropped. Now we're saying, well, the bottom line's going up because of income elasticity of demand in the world. Therefore, that makes the whole deterioration even worse. So you're getting less for your exports, and the price of the things that you so desperately need to develop, they're going up in price even faster. So you really are on all sides, you're being squeezed really on all sides. Now, can you think, would it be possible to include XED in any analysis on that? So are there substitutes for agricultural goods that the developing nations grow? Of course there are, yeah. So if the substitutes are to the demand for their exports, therefore the reduction in price, this downside pressure is getting even bigger. So then you could bring in cross-price elasticity. So rather than just saying, oh, it's to do with demand and supply, then you can broaden it out and a much wider and bigger debate and a much better answer, obviously, any potential question. Yeah, it's a sort of a cycle of deteriorating trade. in developing versus developed. So the exchange rates of the developed world would be going up at the same time as the developing would be going down, because their currency will be in less demand, so it depreciates theirs, whereas the country from which you're importing, well, everybody wants their capital goods, so they'll be pushing theirs up, so it'll be like it's the sort of, the China US, the China one's going down whilst the US one's going up.
Can you not say that these countries have goods that the developing countries can't produce, like exotic food, that is like kind of they choose to specialize in due to the climate they can.
Yeah, but that's to their disadvantage as well, isn't it? Surely. Did you say can produce or can't?
They can.
Can.
Only they can produce.
Okay. Well, that would alter your analysis, wouldn't it? Because although the demand would so the demand would be very inelastic, but what you wouldn't get in that case is you wouldn't get massive supply on the global market, so you wouldn't therefore get the downward pressure on the price if nowhere else can make them. Yeah, so that would alter your analysis, obviously.
Couldn't you argue that like a lot of like resource rich, to say it was a country that like specialised in one certain commodity, wouldn't they normally be earned by like monopoly power from elsewhere? So there would be very little like reinvested into the actual economy.
You mean in terms of foreign direct investments into an economy to, yeah, but you'd have to say that that's probably more going to be with kind of intensive mining and things like that, whereas this is kind of, things that the local population could do because subsistence farming is very commonplace. Yeah. What were you going to say, Jane? Sorry. Okay, Ellie, what were you? No? Okay, come on, Ellie. Now, our counter to this is, as well is the law of diminishing returns, which applies to, well, when we look at the example of diminishing returns, what do we always look at? Farming. Yeah. You're looking at labour combined with a fixed factor of land is always farming. And what happens to when diminishing returns set in, your costs go, so what would happen to the price of the export that they're selling? That would go up. So actually diminishing returns would sort of work in their favour because it would cause an improvement in the terms of trade because the thing that's selling would be going up. But that would only be to your advantage if you could still compete on global markets.